The courthouse stood like a tired old man in the middle of town. Gray stone, tall columns, and windows that hadn't been cleaned in years. Inside, the air smelled faintly of coffee, old paper, and floor wax that had long since lost its shine. It was just past 9 in the morning on a Tuesday, the kind of day that felt like it had already given up before it really began. Rain had drizzled all night, leaving puddles in the potholes outside and damp streaks on the courthouse steps. People shuffled in with umbrellas dripping onto the worn tile floor. Lawyers in slightly rumpled suits, clerks balancing stacks of files, and a few nervous-looking folks waiting for their names to be called in family court. Up on the bench, Judge Harlan Whitmore adjusted his glasses and glanced at the docket. He'd been on the bench for 17 years, and in that time, he'd seen just about everything. Custody battles that turned vicious, parents who showed up high or hungover, teenagers caught stealing candy bars because they were hungry. He wasn't cruel exactly, but he'd grown weary. The system moved slowly, and he'd learned to keep things moving quickly. Efficiency, he believed, was its own kind of mercy. He didn't like delays, didn't like theatrics, and he certainly didn't like surprises, which made what happened next all the more jarring. The courtroom doors creaked open, and for a moment everyone turned, not because of any announcement, but because of the silence that followed. A small figure stood in the doorway, so slight she almost disappeared against the heavy wood frame behind her. She couldn't have been more than 12, maybe younger. Her hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, strands escaping around her face. She wore jeans that were too long at the ankles and a sweater that looked like it had belonged to someone much bigger. Maybe a parent, maybe a sibling. But what caught everyone's attention wasn't her clothes or her age. It was the baby she held in her arms. The infant was swaddled in a thin, faded blanket, eyes half closed, one tiny fist resting against his cheek. The girl held him close to her chest, one arm supporting his head, the other wrapped protectively around his back. She didn't look scared exactly. More like she'd used up all her fear days ago and was running on something else now. Determination, maybe, or sheer stubbornness. The bailiff, a broad-shouldered man named Roy who'd worked the courthouse for over a decade, stepped forward. "Honey," he said gently, "this ain't the place for you right now. You need to wait outside or find your folks." The girl didn't move. She just looked past him, straight toward the bench. Judge Whitmore frowned. He leaned into the microphone. "Is there a guardian with this child?" No one answered. He glanced at the clerk, who shook her head. No case listed for a minor appearing alone with an infant. Nothing on the docket matched this. A few people in the gallery exchanged glances. One woman reached into her purse like she might pull out a snack or a pacifier, then stopped herself. A man in the back shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The judge sighed. He wasn't in the mood for confusion. "Young lady," he said, voice dry, "this is a court of law, not a nursery. I didn't realize we were running a daycare today." A few nervous chuckles rose from the gallery. It wasn't meant to be unkind, just a judge's usual way of cutting through nonsense. But the words landed heavier than he intended. The girl didn't flinch. She didn't blush or look down or burst into tears like so many adults did under his gaze. Instead, she took a slow breath, adjusted the baby in her arms, making sure his head was supported, and walked forward. Her shoes squeaked softly on the polished floor. Every eye followed her. Even the court reporter paused mid-stroke. She stopped a few feet from the bench just outside the railing that separated the public from the court officers. She looked up at the judge, her expression calm but exhausted, like someone who'd been carrying a weight far too long for her frame. "I need to speak," she said. Her voice was quiet but clear, not a whisper, not a shout. Just plain and steady. Judge Whitmore blinked. He'd expected her to turn around and leave. Or maybe start crying, not this. Not that quiet certainty. "You don't have an appointment," he said more gently this time, though still firm. "You can't just walk into a courtroom and expect—" "I've been trying to get an appointment," she interrupted, not rudely, just honestly. For 3 weeks, that stopped him. He studied her face, the dark circles under her eyes, the way her knuckles were white from holding the baby so tightly. This wasn't some kid playing pretend. This was real. "Who are you here for?" he asked. She glanced down at the baby, then back up. "Him and me." The judge leaned back slightly. He motioned to the bailiff. "Roy, see if Child Services has any open case matching this." Roy nodded and stepped aside to make a call. The courtroom settled into an uneasy quiet. No one shuffled papers. No one whispered. Even the usual background hum of the building, the distant ring of a phone, the clatter of a coffee cup seemed to fade away. The girl stood perfectly still. She rocked the baby gently, humming under her breath. A soft, wordless tune that sounded like it had been passed down through generations of lullabies. The baby stirred slightly, nuzzling into her shoulder, but didn't cry. After a moment, Roy came back. "No active case, Your Honor. Nothing flagged under her description." The judge exhaled through his nose. He looked at the girl again. "Do you have a parent or guardian with you?" "No. Do you know your case number?" "Your lawyer's name?" She shook her head. "I don't have a lawyer." "Then why are you here?" "Because no one else will listen." That simple sentence hung in the air like smoke. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't rehearsed. It was just true. The judge felt something shift inside him, something small but undeniable. He'd heard countless pleas in this courtroom, many of them layered with excuses or manipulation. But this felt different, raw, unfiltered. He glanced at the public defender sitting near the front, a woman named Diane who'd been doing this work for 20 years and still somehow hadn't lost her compassion. She gave him a subtle nod, her eyes saying, "Let her talk." Judge Whitmore cleared his throat. "All right," he said. "You can speak, but keep it brief." The girl nodded once as if she'd expected nothing less and nothing more. She didn't step closer, didn't raise her voice. She just began. "I've been taking care of him since he was born," she said, glancing down at the baby again. "Our mom, she tries. But she gets sick a lot. In her head, I mean. And sometimes she leaves for days. Last time she didn't come back." She paused, swallowing hard. "I feed him, change him, sing to him when he won't sleep. I take him to the clinic when he has a fever. I carry him everywhere because I don't have a stroller. I sleep with him on my chest so he doesn't cry from being alone." Her voice didn't break, but her eyes glistened. She blinked fast, refusing to let the tears fall. "I heard this place can help," she continued. "That judges can make sure kids are safe. So I came. I walked here from Maple Street. It took 2 hours with him. I didn't know what else to do. Maple Street. That was the edge of town, near the old rail yard. Not exactly a neighborhood known for stability." The judge felt a knot form in his stomach. He'd seen neglect before, but this wasn't neglect. This was a child stepping into a role no child should ever have to fill. He looked around the room. The gallery was utterly still. One woman had her hand over her mouth. A man in a work uniform wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. "Why didn't you go to child services?" the judge asked, though he already knew the answer. "I did," she said. 3 times. They said they'd send someone. No one came. The last time the lady told me to stop bothering them unless I had paperwork. Paperwork. From a 12-year-old raising a baby. Judge Whitmore took off his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. He'd spent years believing the system worked if you followed the rules. But what if you were too young to know the rules? Too poor to navigate the bureaucracy? Too invisible to matter? He looked at the girl again, really looked. Not as a disruption, not as a problem to be shuffled away, but as a person. A child who'd shown more responsibility in one morning than some adults showed in a lifetime. "Do you have anywhere to stay tonight?" he asked. She hesitated. "The apartment's still ours and for now. But the landlord says we have to leave by Friday. No heat. No water for 3 days." The judge's jaw tightened. He turned to Roy. "Call the on-call social worker now and get me the director of the county's foster care liaison on the line." Then he looked back at the girl. "You're not going back there tonight." Her eyes widened slightly. Not with hope, she'd probably stopped hoping a while ago, but with something like cautious disbelief. "Why?" she asked. "Because," the judge said, his voice softer now, "you shouldn't have to carry this alone." For the first time, a tear slipped down her cheek. She didn't wipe it away. She just held the baby a little tighter as if making sure he was real, that this moment was real. In the back of the room, someone sniffled. Then another, the kind of quiet crying that doesn't make a sound but fills the whole space. Judge Whitmore sat back, his usual stern expression replaced by something quieter, something human. He didn't know what would happen next, the paperwork, the placements, the legal hurdles. But for now, in this moment, he'd done the only thing that mattered. He'd listened. And sometimes listening is the first act of justice. Life hadn't always been this hard. There was a time, fleeting, fragile but real, when mornings began with the smell of toast and the sound of laughter drifting from the kitchen. Back then, the apartment on Maple Street had sunlight that poured through clean windows and the walls weren't stained with damp or cracked from neglect. Back then, their mother still looked them in the eye, but that was before the long silences set in, before the nights stretched into days with no word, no warning, before bottles started appearing in the trash not because they held medicine, but because they held something else, something that made her eyes glassy and her hands shake. The girl never blamed her, not really. She'd overheard enough hushed conversations at school, enough worried whispers from teachers and neighbors, to understand that some hurts live inside a person like ghosts, unseen but always there pulling the strings. Their mother had lost people, lost chances, lost herself piece by piece until all that was left was a shell that sometimes remembered how to smile, but rarely how to stay. The baby, her half-brother, came into the world on a cold February night. The girl was 10 then. She'd stayed home from school that week because their mother was not feeling right, which by then everyone knew was code for something deeper, darker. When the contractions started, it was the girl who called the neighbor downstairs, who helped her mother into the car, who sat in the hospital waiting room for 6 hours with a backpack full of mismatched socks and a granola bar she never ate. She wasn't allowed in the delivery room, of course. But when the nurse finally brought the baby out, tiny, red-faced, wrapped in a pale blue blanket, the girl was the first to hold him. Their mother was too exhausted, too far gone in whatever fog had settled over her mind. So the nurse handed the newborn to the only steady hands available. From that moment on, it was her. She learned fast how to mix formula without bubbles, how to burp him over her shoulder without spilling, how to tell the difference between a hungry cry and a tired one. She gave up her bed so he could sleep in a crib someone donated from the church. She stayed up through the night when he spiked a fever, pressing cool cloths to his forehead and whispering songs she barely remembered from her own childhood. School became something she squeezed in between feedings and diaper changes. She'd rush out the door with his bottle in one hand and her backpack in the other, praying the bus wouldn't be late. Teachers noticed the dark circles under her eyes, the way she sometimes dozed off during math. But when they asked if everything was okay at home, she'd just nod and say, "Yeah, fine." Because what else could she say? That she was raising a baby while her mother drifted in and out like a shadow? By the time she turned 12, she'd stopped expecting her mother to come back for good. The disappearances grew longer, 3 days, then a week, then 2. Once, she came home to find the fridge empty, the electricity shut off, and a note on the counter that just said, "Gone to get help." Back soon. That was 6 weeks ago. Soon never came. The landlord started knocking. First politely, then with a frown, then with an eviction notice taped to the door. She tried explaining, but he just sighed and said, "I got bills too, kid." She didn't argue. She just nodded and went back inside to warm a bottle on the stove using the last of the propane. She'd heard about child services from a girl at school whose cousin had been placed in foster care. "They help," the girl had said. "They find you a safe place." So one afternoon, after putting the baby down for a nap, she walked to the county office downtown. She waited in a plastic chair for over an hour, clutching a folder she'd made with drawings of their apartment, a list of the baby's doctor visits, even a photo of him smiling. When she finally got to speak to someone, a woman with tired eyes and a name tag that read Linda, she poured out everything. Linda listened, nodded, took notes. "We'll look into it," she said. "Someone will follow up." But no one did. She went back a week later. This time Linda wasn't there. A different worker told her they were overwhelmed and that unless there was immediate danger, they couldn't prioritize her case. "Do you have bruises?" the woman asked bluntly. "Is he being hurt?" "No," the girl said. "But we have no heat, no running water, and I'm scared we'll be on the street," the woman sighed. "Without documented risk, there's not much we can do." "Try family." She didn't have family. Not really. Her father had left before she could walk. Her mother's side lived out of state and had made it clear they wanted nothing to do with that mess. She'd called them once, voice trembling, and the man who answered said, "We've got our own kids to worry about," before hanging up. So she tried again. Third time she brought the baby with her. Maybe seeing him would help. Maybe holding him would make them understand. But the receptionist wouldn't even let her past the front desk. "No unaccompanied minors," she said, not unkindly but firmly. "Come back with a guardian." She stood there, baby in arms, feeling the walls close in. That's when she remembered something her fifth-grade teacher once said. "If you can't get through the door, go to the person who holds the key." And who held the key in this town? The judge. She didn't know how courts worked. Didn't know about filings or motions or legal representation, but she knew stories. Real ones from the news, from neighbors. And in those stories, judges were the ones who made things right. They decided who stayed together, who got help, who deserved a second chance, so she saved every dollar she could. A neighbor paid her $5 to watch her cat for a weekend. Another gave her a bag of diapers and a jar of peanut butter. She sold her old tablet online for $30. With that, she bought a bus pass and a new blanket for the baby. Thicker, warmer, the kind that wouldn't unravel at the edges. The night before she went to court, she stayed up late washing his only clean onesie in the sink, wringing it out with her hands, and hanging it over the radiator that hadn't worked in months. She packed a small bag, 2 bottles, a pacifier he rarely used but liked to hold, a stuffed rabbit with one ear chewed off, and the birth certificate she'd hidden under her mattress like treasure. She didn't sleep. She just sat on the floor beside his crib, watching his chest rise and fall, memorizing the sound of his breath. If this didn't work, if the judge turned her away like everyone else, she didn't know what she'd do. Sleep in the bus station? Ask the church for shelter? She'd heard stories about kids who vanished into the system, siblings split apart, babies sent to strangers who didn't know their rhythms, their fears, their favorite lullabies. She couldn't let that happen, so at dawn, she dressed him in layers, wrapped him tight against the morning chill, and stepped out into the gray light. The walk to the courthouse was long, especially with him growing heavier in her arms. Twice she stopped to rest on a bench, bouncing him gently when he started to fuss. A woman at a bus stop offered her a bottle of water. A man walking his dog smiled and said, "You're doing a good job." She didn't say thank you, she just nodded, because if she opened her mouth she might cry, and she couldn't afford to fall apart now. By the time she reached the courthouse steps, her legs ached and her shoulders burned. But she stood tall. She smoothed her sweater. She kissed the baby's forehead and whispered, "We're gonna be okay." She didn't believe it, not fully, but she said it anyway, because someone had to. And that's how she found herself standing in the doorway of a courtroom, facing a judge who thought she was a disruption, a mistake, a child out of place. But she wasn't out of place, she was exactly where she needed to be, because sometimes the only person who can speak for a child is another child. And in that moment, with the weight of her brother in her arms and the echo of every sleepless night behind her, she wasn't just a girl. She was a promise, a protector, a voice for someone who couldn't speak yet. She didn't know it then, but her walk into that courtroom would ripple far beyond those stone walls. It would wake something in people who'd grown numb to suffering. It would remind a weary judge that justice isn't just about laws, it's about listening. And it would begin a chain of kindnesses that no one saw coming, but none of that mattered right now. Right now, all that mattered was keeping him safe, and for the first time in a long time, she felt a flicker of something she'd almost forgotten. Hope. Not the loud, flashy kind. Not the kind that comes with guarantees, but the quiet, stubborn kind. The kind that shows up when everything else has failed and says, "Keep going." So she kept going. One step, one breath, one heartbeat at a time. The courtroom felt heavier now, like the air itself had thickened with everything left unsaid. The girl stood just beyond the wooden railing, arms still wrapped around the baby who had drifted into a light sleep against her shoulder. She didn't fidget, didn't look around for reassurance. She just waited, as if she'd been waiting her whole life for someone to finally see her. Judge Whitmore studied her from the bench, his earlier impatience replaced by something quieter, uncertainty, maybe, or the slow dawning of understanding. He'd spent years believing that order came from rules, that fairness meant treating everyone the same. But standing before him wasn't a case file or a docket number. It was a child holding another child, both of them caught in a storm no one had bothered to shield them from. He cleared his throat. "You said your mother's been gone for weeks?" "Yes," she replied. Her voice was soft but steady, like a candle flame in a closed room, small but not easily blown out. "And no relatives have stepped in?" She shook her head. They don't want us. The judge glanced at the public defender in the front row. Diane, a woman with silver-streaked hair and a reputation for never backing down when kids were involved. She gave him a slight nod, her eyes saying what she couldn't say aloud. This isn't just a housing issue. This is survival. He turned back to the girl. Do you know where your mother is now? No, sir, as she called. Sent a message? No, he paused. And you've been caring for your brother? Alone? Yes. For how long? Since he was born, mostly. That answer landed like a stone in still water. A few people in the gallery shifted in their seats. Someone sniffled quietly. The court reporter, who'd seen hundreds of hearings, slowed her typing, as if even the machine sensed this wasn't ordinary. Judge Whitmore leaned forward slightly. You understand this court handles legal matters. Custody disputes, foster placements, protective orders. We don't usually take walk-ins. I know, she said, but I didn't know where else to go. Her honesty was disarming. There was no anger in her voice, no blame, just a raw, unvarnished truth that cut through the usual courtroom noise. She wasn't demanding. She wasn't performing. She was simply stating facts, as if listing the weather or the time of day. The judge exhaled slowly. He looked down at his notes, though there was nothing written yet. This wasn't on the schedule. There was no file, no attorney, no social worker present. By every rule in the book, he should have asked her to leave, to come back with proper representation, to follow the process like everyone else. But something in him resisted that, because the process had already failed her. He thought of the dozens of dependency cases he'd signed off on, stacks of paperwork, checklist timelines, children shuffled between homes, siblings separated for logistical reasons, babies placed with strangers because no one could find a relative in time. He'd always told himself the system worked if you gave it time, but what if you didn't have time? What if every day without heat, without food, without safety, was another crack in a child's spirit? He looked at her again. The way her sweater sleeve had slipped down her wrist, revealing a faint bruise from carrying the baby's car seat. The way she subtly adjusted her stance to ease the weight on her hip. The quiet vigilance in her eyes, always checking on the infant, always listening for his breath. This wasn't negligence. This was love wearing itself thin. Roy, he said to the bailiff, call the on-call social worker again. Tell them it's urgent. And get me the director of the county's emergency placement unit on the line. If they're not available, their supervisor. Roy nodded and stepped out quickly. Then the judge turned to the gallery. Does anyone here work with youth services?
Foster care?
Any nonprofit that handles emergency kinship placements? A woman near the back raised her hand. I'm with Bright Horizons Family Support, she said. We assist with temporary housing for sibling groups and relative caregivers. Come forward, please. She stood, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and a tote bag full of brochures she probably never needed to hand out because she knew every detail by heart. She walked to the front and introduced herself quietly. Judge Whitmore didn't ask for credentials. He didn't need to. He could see it in the way she looked at the girl, not with pity but with recognition. Like she'd seen this story before in 100 different towns. Do you have capacity for an emergency placement tonight? He asked. We do, she said. We prioritize keeping siblings together, always. He nodded, then looked back at the girl. Do you have any belongings with you? Just what's in my bag, she said, glancing at the small backpack at her feet. All right. He turned to the court clerk. Note this as an informal emergency intervention. Not a formal custody hearing yet, but we're initiating a welfare check and temporary protective placement effective immediately. The clerk blinked. Your Honor, we don't have a petition filed. No motion. I'm aware, he said calmly. Consider this the court acting sua sponte, due to imminent risk of homelessness and lack of adult supervision. Documented as such, the room fell silent again. This wasn't standard procedure. It wasn't even close, but no one objected. Not the clerk, not the attorneys, not even the stern-faced prosecutor who usually fought every deviation from protocol. Because everyone in that room knew, really knew, that if they sent this girl back to that apartment, something terrible might happen. And no one wanted that on their conscience. The judge looked at the girl once more. You and your brother won't be going back to Maple Street tonight. You'll stay with a temporary foster family approved by Bright Horizons. They have experience with infants and older siblings. You'll have your own room, food, heat, someone to help you while we sort this out. Her eyes widened slightly. Not with excitement, she was too tired for that, but with disbelief, like she was waiting for the other shoe to drop. Why? She asked again, voice barely above a whisper. Because, he said. And this time there was no dryness in his tone, no impatience. You showed up. You spoke up. And that matters. She didn't cry, but her lower lip trembled just once before she pressed it between her teeth. The woman from Bright Horizons stepped closer. Honey, she said gently, can I hold him for a minute while you sit down? You must be exhausted, the girl hesitated. For a long moment she looked at the baby, then at the woman, then back at the judge. Trust didn't come easy after weeks of being ignored. It's okay, the judge said. She's here to help. Slowly, carefully, the girl shifted the baby into the woman's arms. The moment he left her chest, her hands hovered nearby, ready to take him back if he stirred. But he didn't. He nestled into the stranger's shoulder as if he, too, had been waiting for someone kind. The girl sank into the nearest chair, her shoulders slumping for the first time. She rubbed her eyes with the heels of her hands, like a child who'd finally been allowed to stop pretending she was fine. Judge Whitmore watched her, and for the first time in years, he felt the weight of his role not as a burden, but as a responsibility he'd almost forgotten. He'd been so focused on moving cases along that he'd stopped seeing the people behind them. But here was a reminder, small, quiet, and carrying more courage than most adults he knew. The bailiff returned with a social worker on the phone. The judge took the receiver, spoke briefly, then handed it to the Bright Horizons woman to coordinate pickup. Within 20 minutes, a car would be outside, but before that happened, the judge did something unusual. He stepped down from the bench. Gasps rippled through the room. Judges didn't do that, not during a session, not for an unscheduled appearance. But he didn't care. He walked slowly to where the girl sat, crouched slightly so he wasn't towering over her, and looked her in the eye. You did the right thing coming here, he said. You protected him. That's not something every adult can say. She looked up at him, searching his face for mockery or condescension. Finding none, she gave the tiniest nod. I'm scared, she admitted so quietly only he could hear. I know, he said, but you won't be alone anymore. At that moment, the baby let out a soft coo. The woman from Bright Horizons smiled and rocked him gently. He's got your eyes, she said to the girl. The girl managed a faint smile in return, the first real one anyone had seen all morning. Outside, rain began to fall again, tapping softly against the courthouse windows. But inside, something had shifted. Not just for the girl and her brother, but for everyone who'd witnessed it. The lawyer who'd rolled his eyes at emotional cases now stared at his hands, thinking of his own niece. The clerk wiped her eyes with a tissue. Even the prosecutor, known for his tough stance on procedure, quietly slipped a $20 bill into the donation jar by the door, labeled Emergency Needs Fund. Judge Whitmore returned to the bench, but he didn't call the next case. He let the moment breathe. Because sometimes justice isn't about rulings or rulings. It's about restoring dignity. And today a child had walked into a place that had forgotten how to see her, and reminded them all what it meant to be human. As the foster car pulled up outside, the girl stood, took her brother back into her arms, and turned toward the door. She paused, looked back at the judge, and said, "Thank you." He didn't say, "You're welcome," he just nodded. Because some things don't need words. And as she stepped out into the rain, this time with someone walking beside her, someone who knew her name, someone who would make sure she wasn't invisible anymore, the courthouse didn't feel so cold anymore. It felt like the beginning of something new. The courtroom had quieted, but the air still hummed with something unspoken, like the echo of a truth too big to fit into legal forms or case numbers. The girl stood near the front now, no longer at the edge of the room like an intruder, but closer to the center, as if the space itself had made room for her. The baby was back in her arms, awake this time, blinking up at the high ceiling with wide, curious eyes. He made a soft, gurgling sound, and she instinctively bounced him gently, her body moving with a rhythm that came from months, years of practice. Judge Whitmore watched her, his earlier impatience long gone. He'd called for temporary placement, yes, but something in him knew that wasn't enough. Not yet. There was more to say. More to understand. He hadn't let her speak fully before, Just fragments, pieces of a much larger story. And now, with the room still full and the moment still tender, he leaned slightly forward and said, "Tell me everything." From the beginning. She looked up, surprised. Most adults didn't ask for everything. They asked for the part that fit their schedule, their form, their version of the story. But this man, this judge with tired eyes and a voice that had softened like worn leather, was asking for all of it. She took a breath. "I didn't mean to come here like this," she started, her voice low but clear. "I tried to do it right. I went to the office 3 times. I brought his birth certificate. I wrote down all the doctors he's seen, all the times I took him when he had a fever. I even drew a picture of our apartment so they could see the leak in the ceiling. The broken window we covered with plastic." She paused, glancing down at the baby, who reached up and grabbed a loose thread on her sweater. She didn't pull away. She let him hold on. "No one came," she continued. "The first time they said they'd send someone next week. The second time, they said they were short-staffed. The third time, the lady at the front desk told me, 'Unless someone's hitting you, there's not much we can do.'" Her voice didn't rise. It didn't shake. It just carried the weight of disappointment like a familiar coat. "I didn't know what else to do. I couldn't go to school and watch him at the same time. The neighbor used to help, but she moved away. I asked the church, but they said they only help families with parents. I even called the number on the back of the formula can, just to ask if there was a program for kids like us. They transferred me to 3 different people before hanging up. A few people in the gallery exchanged glances. One woman covered her mouth with her hand. This wasn't a story from a movie. This was real. This was happening right here in their town, while they'd been going about their days assuming someone else was handling it. The girl kept going. "I bottle feed him with water from the gas station because our tap water smells like metal. I boil it first, like they said on the internet. I walk 2 miles every Thursday to the food pantry. I carry him the whole way in this old sling I found at the thrift store. He cries sometimes, but I sing to him. The same song my mom used to hum when I was little. I don't even remember the words, just the tune." She looked up at the judge now, her eyes steady. "I sleep with him on my chest so he doesn't wake up scared. When it thunders, he gets this look, like the whole world's falling apart. So I hold him tight and tell him it's just the sky talking. I don't know if that's true, but it helps." Her voice cracked just once, barely noticeable, but enough to make the judge's throat tighten. "I know I'm just a kid," she said, softer now. "I know I'm not supposed to be the one taking care of him, but who else is going to do it? If you take him away, who's going to remember he likes his bottle warm, not hot? Who's going to know he won't sleep unless his feet are covered? Who's going to notice when he's getting sick before he even cries?" She swallowed hard. "He's my brother, and I'm all he's got." That last sentence didn't land like a plea. It landed like a fact, simple, undeniable, carved into her bones, and then silence. Not the kind of silence that's empty, but the kind that's full of breath held, of hearts breaking, of people realizing they'd been walking past this kind of pain for years without seeing it. The judge didn't speak right away. He just looked at her. Really looked, and for the first time in a long time, he didn't see a case. He saw a child who'd been handed a burden no one should carry, and carried it anyway. With grace, with love, with a quiet kind of heroism that didn't ask for applause. Behind him, the court reporter had stopped typing, not because she was supposed to, but because her hands were trembling too much to keep up. In the front row, Diane, the public defender, wiped her eyes with the back of her hand and whispered, "My God." The woman from Bright Horizons stood perfectly still, the baby's tiny sock she'd been holding now clenched in her fist. Judge Whitmore slowly removed his glasses. He didn't put them back on. He just held them in one hand and looked at the girl with bare eyes, human eyes, not judicial ones. "You shouldn't have had to do any of this alone," he said. His voice rougher than before. She didn't say anything. She just nodded, because there was nothing left to explain. Then, something unexpected happened. The man in the back, the one in the work uniform who'd been there for a small claims hearing, stood up. "I own a hardware store on Elm," he said, his voice thick. "We've got extra space in the back office, heat, running water, a couch that folds out. If they need somewhere tonight before the placement, they can stay there. No charge." Before anyone could respond, the woman who'd covered her mouth spoke up. "I teach 3rd grade at Lincoln Elementary. I've got a spare room, and I've got a crib. My daughter outgrew it last year. It's still good, another voice. I drive the school bus. I can pick her up, take her to appointments, whatever she needs. One by one, people began offering, not out of pity but out of recognition. This wasn't charity. This was community waking up. Judge Whitmore listened, his expression unreadable but his eyes glistening. He didn't stop them. He let the room fill with offers, with humanity, with the kind of help that doesn't wait for paperwork. But then he raised a hand gently, and the room quieted again. What this young lady needs, he said, is stability, not just for tonight, but for good. And that starts with the system doing its job. He turned to the clerk. File an emergency motion for temporary guardianship. Not foster care, kinship placement. She's not a stranger to that child. She's his sister, his caregiver, his protector. We treat that with the seriousness it deserves. Then he looked at the social worker who'd finally arrived, breathless and flustered from rushing across town. You will assign a dedicated caseworker by end of day, not a rotating substitute. Someone who will visit weekly, not monthly. Someone who will listen. The social worker nodded quickly, already scribbling notes. Judge Whitmore turned back to the girl. You won't have to walk into another office alone again. You won't have to beg for help. From this moment on, people will come to you. She looked at him, searching for loopholes, for fine print, for the catch that always came. But there wasn't one. And one more thing, he added, his voice softer now. You're going to school. Every day, Bright Horizons will arrange transportation. They'll provide tutoring if you've fallen behind. And you'll have time, real time, to be a kid, not just a caretaker. For the first time, her composure wavered. A tear slipped down her cheek, then another. She didn't wipe them away. She just held her brother closer, as if making sure he felt the change too. I just wanted someone to listen, she whispered. You were heard, the judge said, and you'll keep being heard. Outside, the rain had stopped. Sunlight broke through the clouds, casting long golden streaks across the courthouse floor. It felt like a sign. Not a miracle, just a reminder that even after the longest storm, light finds its way back. The woman from Bright Horizons stepped forward. The foster home is ready. They've got a room set up with a crib, a changing table, even some books. And they've agreed to keep you both together. No questions, no delays. The girl nodded. She didn't say thank you again. She didn't need to. Her eyes said it all. As she turned to leave, the judge stood. Not from the bench, from his chair. He walked down the steps slowly, deliberately, until he was standing just a few feet from her. I'm sorry it took you walking in here for someone to see you, he said quietly. She looked up at him, and for the first time there was a flicker of something like peace in her eyes. You saw me, she said. And with that she walked out, not as a girl dragging a burden, but as a sister carrying hope. Behind her, the courtroom remained still for a long time. No one moved to the next case. No one shuffled papers. They just sat in the quiet aftermath of something sacred. Because sometimes the most powerful words aren't written in law books. They're spoken by a child who's been told she doesn't matter, and proves, with every breath that she does, and in that moment, everyone in that room, judge, lawyer, clerk, stranger, understood something they'd forgotten. That justice isn't just about rules. It's about seeing people, really seeing them, and once you see, you can't unsee, so they wouldn't. Not ever again. Months passed and the world kept turning. But in that small town, something had shifted. It wasn't loud or flashy. There were no headlines, no viral videos, no grand announcements. But if you paid attention, you'd notice the quiet changes. The courthouse now kept a basket of diapers and baby wipes near the family court entrance. The Child Services Office hired 2 new caseworkers just for kinship placements. And every Thursday afternoon, a retired school teacher showed up at a modest house on the edge of town with books, homework help, and a thermos of hot chocolate for 2. The girl and her brother lived in a cozy home now, with warm floors, running water that didn't smell like rust, and a backyard where dandelions pushed through the grass in spring. Their foster family, 2 older adults who'd raised 3 kids of their own and still had love to spare, didn't treat them like temporary guests. They treated them like family. They learned how the baby liked his bottle warm just enough to feel like skin. They bought the girl new shoes that fit. They hung her drawings on the fridge. She went to school every day. Not just physically, but really went, asked questions, joined the after-school reading club, even laughed during lunch with a group of girls who'd once thought she was weird for always carrying a baby. Now they asked how he was doing. They brought her extra snacks for him. They didn't know it, but they were stitching her back into childhood, one small kindness at a time. And the baby? He thrived. His cheeks filled out. His giggles grew louder. He reached for toys, babbled nonsense words, and clapped when the girl walked into the room. He didn't remember the cold apartment or the nights without light. All he knew was safety, warmth, and the steady rhythm of his sister's voice singing him to sleep. But the real change, the deeper, slower kind, happened in places no one could see at first. Judge Whitmore began doing something unusual. After his regular docket, he'd set aside 1 hour every Friday just for unrepresented minors in dependency matters. No appointments needed. Just walk in and someone would listen. He called it open bench hour, though everyone knew it was really just him making sure no child ever had to stand alone in a courtroom again. He also started meeting monthly with child services. Not to scold, but to ask, what's missing? Where are we failing before it gets to my courtroom? He pushed for faster response times, better training for front desk staff, and a new policy that prioritized keeping siblings together, even if it meant stretching resources. At first, some officials resisted. We're underfunded, they'd say. Overwhelmed. But the judge didn't argue. He just handed them a transcript, 1 page printed neatly. It was the part where the girl said, "Who's going to remember he likes his bottle warm, not hot?" He didn't say a word. He just let the question hang in the air until they understood. This wasn't about budgets. It was about belonging. Meanwhile, the girl didn't become a symbol. She didn't give interviews or stand on stages. She just lived. She learned to ride a bike in the driveway. She got her first library card. She started writing stories, short ones, about brave animals and secret gardens, and tucked them into the baby's diaper bag like hidden treasures. One afternoon, months after that rainy Tuesday, she walked back to the courthouse. Not because she had to, not because she was in trouble, but because she wanted to say thank you. She didn't go in through the main doors this time. She used the side entrance where the staff knew her now. The bailiff, Roy, smiled when he saw her. "Well, look who's back," he said, crouching slightly to greet the baby, who reached for his badge with curious fingers. "I brought him," she said, adjusting the strap of the stroller she now pushed with ease. "He's never seen where it all started." Roy nodded, eyes soft. "Judge is in chambers. I'll let him know you're here." She waited in the hallway, not nervously this time, but calmly. She watched sunlight stream through the high windows, dust motes dancing in the beams. It felt different now. Less like a place of judgment, more like a place where things could begin again. When the judge stepped out, he wasn't in his robe. Just a sweater and slacks like any other man after work. But his eyes lit up when he saw her. "You're taller," he said. She smiled. "He is too." They walked together to a small courtyard behind the courthouse, a quiet spot with benches and a single oak tree. She sat and the baby babbled happily, kicking his feet in the stroller. "I'm doing okay," she said, not because he asked, but because she wanted him to know. "School's good. He sleeps through the night now, and I got my first A on a math test." The judge didn't say, "I'm proud of you." He didn't need to. He just nodded like he'd known she would. They sat in comfortable silence for a while. Then he asked, "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't come that day?" She thought about it. "Sometimes. But then I look at him and I know I had to try." He looked at the baby, now grabbing at leaves that had fallen from the tree, and said quietly, "You didn't just save him. You reminded all of us what this job is really about." She didn't know how to respond to that, so she just said, "I brought you something." From her bag, she pulled out a small, slightly crumpled drawing. It showed a courtroom, but instead of a stern judge, there was a kind-looking man handing a blanket to a girl holding a baby. In the corner, in careful handwriting, it read, "Thank you for listening." The judge took it. He didn't fold it or tuck it away. He held it like it was something precious. "I'll hang this in my office," he said, and he did, right next to his law degrees and gavels, not as a trophy but as a compass. As the months turned into a year, the story didn't end. It just grew quieter, deeper, like roots spreading under the soil. The girl turned 13. She started thinking about high school, maybe even college someday. The baby took his first steps right in the living room of their new home, arms outstretched toward his sister. And the judge? He never forgot. One evening, long after work, he sat at his desk going through old files. He came across the docket from that Tuesday, the one with no case number, no formal entry, just a handwritten note in the margin. Emergency intervention. Sibling pair. Immediate placement. Follow-up required. He stared at it for a long time. Then he picked up the phone and called the director of the state's child welfare agency. "I want to propose a pilot program," he said, "for courts to partner directly with community volunteers, teachers, retired nurses, small business owners, who can offer immediate short-term support while cases are processed. No red tape, just human help." The director listened, then said, "You're talking about that girl, aren't you?" "Yes," the judge admitted. "She taught me that sometimes the law moves too slow for a child's need." The program launched 6 months later. They called it the Listening Bench Initiative. It started in 1 county, then spread to 3, then 10. It wasn't perfect, but it was something. Back in town, life went on. The girl still visited the courthouse sometimes, not for help, but just to say hello. And every time, without fail, someone would have a bottle of warm milk ready, just in case. Not because it was policy, but because it was promise. Because once you've seen a child carry the weight of the world in her arms, you never stop making sure she doesn't have to do it alone again. And that, more than any ruling or reform, was the real victory. Not a grand finale, not a perfect ending, but a quiet, steady beginning, where a girl and her brother could finally just be kids, and a judge could finally remember why he'd wanted to wear the robe in the first place. In the end, it wasn't about who was right or wrong. It was about who was willing to listen. And on that gray Tuesday morning in a courthouse that had almost forgotten how, a child spoke, and the world at last leaned in close enough to hear.